Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is the place where we interview published fiction writers to gather their insights, writing techniques, and advice, and to get up to speed on their latest piece of work. This is your host, Mike Consol. Naturally, I encourage you to subscribe to this podcast and to my YouTube channel, and to share this podcast with friends, family members, aspiring writers, inveterate readers, and any others who you think would be entertained or benefit from Novelist Spotlight. There's nothing more powerful than word of mouth, and we count on you and our other listeners for that. Now, on with the program.
In the spotlight during this episode is Dr. Michael J. Collins, author of All Bleeding Stops. This novel takes readers to Vietnam at the height of the war, following a young doctor named Matthew Barrett in his struggle to acclimate to the harsh and violent medical environment. The Kirkus Review calls the book a gut-wrenching, and I'm quoting here, a gut-wrenching and expertly wrought drama, plunging readers into the atrocities of war, as well as offering uplifting moments of human connection. And on the Goodreads site, reviewers have rated it on average 4.75 out of 5 stars on their rating scale. You can also learn more about Michael J. Collins and his book at his website, which is www.michaeljcollinsmd.com. Doctor, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
You know, when I heard about a doctor writing a book, who comes to mind immediately were people like Robin Cook, Michael Crichton, and some other authors out there who were medically trained and wrote books that ran along the lines of their training. I mean, Michael Crichton was all over the place, but he, with the Andromeda strain, there was, I think, a hint of that, and then also Jurassic Park with the cloning. Robin Cook with, I think he did a book about contagion and so on. Were you influenced by any of those authors, or was this something that came kind of a little bit more purely to you?
I've been influenced by a number of doctors who were writers. Going back some, Chekhov was a physician, so was Keats, and in more modern times, Richard Seltzer was a big influence on me. Oliver Sacks, Abraham Verghese, whose books are popular these days, was also a big influence. Early on, I would say the writer probably that you are not likely to have heard of, nor many of your listeners, but A.J. Cronin was a either Scottish or English writer who wrote a lot of books about, and he was a doctor and wrote books about doctoring, and I read those many years ago, and I thought those had a big influence on me.
Tell me why you decided to write this book. You're a busy guy. Any medical doctor is. You're in the middle of a pandemic right now with the coronavirus. You have all kinds of journals to read to keep up on medicine. How do you work this into your schedule?
Well, All Bleeding Stops came about because of something that's been eating at me for years. When I was a senior medical student assigned to a cardiology service at the local VA hospital, the intern on our service committed suicide. And it was such a shock to me, and I struggled to understand what had happened. I wasn't terribly close to this individual, but he seemed to be a conscientious, caring sort of a guy, and I never really could wrap my mind around it. And it puzzled me all these years, and as time went by, I would see more and more doctors struggling with the difficulties of their profession. Specifically, I think it's the sensitive and caring people are the ones who tend to be drawn to medicine. And sometimes they're too sensitive and too caring. And at least that's been my observation. It's not true of every doctor, but some doctors don't care enough. But there are some doctors who care too much, and that can be very destructive to them. And that's what All Bleeding Stops is about. A young, idealistic, sensitive young man who's drafted right out of his residency, sent to Vietnam, and thrust into the midst of all this suffering and destruction. And he does his best, but never feels his best is good enough.
Yeah, I lost a brother to suicide, so I understand the shock of that firsthand. Are suicide rates among physicians higher than other professions? Is it somewhat endemic to the profession?
It is. The suicide rate among physicians is twice what it is among the general population. 300 to 400 doctors commit suicide every year. And to put that in perspective, that's roughly twice the size of my graduating medical school class that's lost every year.
Wow. Talk about the writing regimen that you've adopted. How did you get this book written? What time of day? How did you integrate it into your work schedule?
It was difficult for me because I am not solely a writer. As you have mentioned, I'm a doctor, and that takes a lot of time. So I never really could have a regimen. I couldn't say I will write at this time every day or on the weekends, and sometimes I could and sometimes I couldn't. And there would be times when I would write quite a bit, get a lot done in a week, and there were times where I would not touch a pen or touch my laptop for a week. So I never had a regimen. I just did it when I could.
So you never were able to develop a rhythm. I mean, that's the sort of thing that I kind of emphasize with writers is that if you want to write at, optimal, at the apotheosis of your talent, make sure that you're writing every day so that you pick up momentum and that you actually get into a flow. That wasn't possible for you, so it sounds like it was catch as catch can. Did you find that to be, when you were picking up where you left off, did you find that to be problematic, or was it something that came back to you quickly?
Well, it came back out of necessity, I think, because I had time crunches, and I really couldn't afford, if I had 45 minutes or 3 hours or whatever I could write, I subconsciously realized I didn't have time to mess around. I needed to get busy. I think the advice that you give to your aspiring writers is a good one. I think it is better if you can have a time every day and sort of get yourself into a rhythm, but I didn't have that luxury.
Now, did you have to catch yourself making sure that you weren't using too many technical terms or you weren't getting into too much minutia? Was that part of the editing process, perhaps? Why don't we put this into language that's a little bit more conversational or every man, every woman in terms of their ability to relate to it?
Yes, that was certainly a problem for me, or something that I paid attention to. And what was even a bigger problem, I thought, was that because I'm a surgeon, things that didn't shock me and just were normal everyday things, I realized were very shocking to lay people as they read them. So I had to be careful not to sound too matter of fact as I describe some of the horrible things that can happen.
Let's talk about the venue. You picked Vietnam, and there's been a lot of books, nonfiction and fiction books written about Vietnam. Very often an author is very place dependent in terms of wanting to write about a place he or she knows very well or has a real feel for. Why Vietnam? And have you traveled to Vietnam? Did you do any research in that way? Or is it just the sort of thing that there's such a wealth of knowledge about the place that you're able to research from afar?
Well, I chose Vietnam because I thought it was the perfect milieu in which to place Matthew Barrett. As everyone knows, when we talk about Vietnam, there's all kinds of mixed feelings and uncertainties, and that's how Matthew Barrett was. He wanted to be one thing and wasn't what he wanted to be, and so all the sort of mixed up emotions that were in Matthew Barrett were also a part of Vietnam. I did not serve in Vietnam, although some of my relatives and friends did. I did a great deal of research about the book, and I talked to, I think, literally hundreds of veterans, read a pile of books about Vietnam, and all of which I think helped a lot to lend a feeling of authenticity to the book.
Now, did you outline the entire book, or did you kind of have a character get started and see if it would develop organically? Because people have different philosophies about approaching writing. It can be very intimidating, of course, to start writing a book without an outline. Did you have an outline, and how detailed was it, if you did have one?
I did not have an outline per se. I had an idea what I wanted to say, that there was a young doctor struggling with his commitment and his profession, and that it would be in Vietnam, and that he would have a difficult time. And I would find, but I did not outline. But as the book went on, I would frequently stop at some point and outline at that point and say, well, here's what I have so far, and does this make sense, and does that following this make sense, or should I move this scene to a different part? So I would play with it back and forth. I used to enjoy, I've been to a lot of writers' conferences and writing meetings, and I used to be skeptical when I would hear authors talk about the book wrote itself, or the characters would sometimes speak to them and tell them what was going to happen. And I just didn't believe it. I thought, oh, that's just silly new age sort of stuff. But I found that actually, at least in my case, it does happen. I mean, it's not the only thing that happens, and it doesn't mean that I absent myself in the process. But it's interesting to find how much, as you get into these stories, your subconscious helps to advance the story.
Yeah, it's almost magical the way that will develop. I'm curious whether you knew what the ending would be. It's one thing to not work with an outline. It's another thing to kind of not know really where you're going to finish. And I'm reminded of John Irving, who says that he comes up with the last word of his novel, not last word, the last sentence of his novel first, and then writes towards that, which sounds incredibly scary in terms of trying to keep things on track. Just in terms of the ending, did you already know where you were going to finish it?
I did not. I wasn't sure at the end of the book, would Matthew live or would he die, or how would all this come about? And that sort of seemed to come as I wrote the story.
How long did the book take you?
Well, when I tell you the literal answer to that, it's a little bit misleading. I wrote my first book in 2005. My second book was published in 2009. And I started work on All Bleeding Stops before 2009. So I suppose I started maybe in 2008 or 7, which makes it, 14 years or so that I worked on it. But the reason it's misleading is that I was a pretty busy guy during much of that time and just couldn't spend as much time on it as I liked. And then when I would get to one point where I'd think that I might be done, I would read it over and not be happy with it. So I tinkered with it for a long time.
So if you were a full-time writer, let's say, you gave up the medical profession, do you have any sense of how long it would take you to actually produce, a full-length novel, say your next one?
That is a difficult question to answer because I still have a hard time thinking of myself as a writer. It seems to me more accurate to say I'm a doctor who writes. Now, I was careful enough as I began this whole process and smart enough, I think, to realize that you can't just say, I went to college and therefore I know how to write. You don't. I mean, unless maybe there's some geniuses out there who do. But I had to do a lot of work learning to write. There's an art to it, and it's a craft, and you have to study. So I took a long time when I wrote my first book. The first draft of it that I thought was so good, when I went back and read it, I thought it was terrible. So I took online courses and went to writing courses and did all those sort of things and read in a different way. I always used to read for pleasure. And for a long time now, I read to study it, the technique and how do people get ideas across in books. So it would be very difficult. And I am working on another book now, but I would not hazard a guess as to how long it's going to take.
What is the best piece of writing advice that you picked up along the way, or what was the biggest lesson you learned just from your own efforts?
I would say in terms of advice, I always thought the best advice was just get something down on paper. Even if you're struggling, just write and get get something down, right? And then sometimes things will flow from that. You can always revise and edit and fix things later. I found that sometimes if you get something down on paper, that later things will come to you, but nothing's going to happen if you don't get something down on paper.
Now, you mentioned you have another book coming up. Can you talk about that one a little bit? What's the title and what's kind of the premise?
It's not titled yet. I am a little bit reluctant, Mike, to talk about works in progress, only because it's a fluid situation. And if I try to describe what I'm doing, even to myself, it almost seems like I straitjacket myself. I think if you had asked me 10 years ago when I was working on All Bleeding Stops, what's it about? I wouldn't have. What I thought it was about at that point wasn't quite what it turned out to be in the end. So I can tell you, I'm a doctor. All my books are about medicine. So the first book that I wrote was about being a resident who spent an awful lot of time moonlighting when I was at the Mayo Clinic. And the second book was about, I was a construction worker for several years, not sure where my life was headed, and I decided I wanted to go to med school. So it's about a construction worker trying to get into med school. Then All Bleeding Stops, we've been talking about. The next book it's about a doctor, and it's about struggling with his conceptions of what it means to be a doctor and what obligations that entails.
I understand completely. I understand your reticence in that regard. Let me ask you about Dr. Barrett in your current book, in the development of him as a character. Is he based on somebody you know? Is he based on, did you take the characteristics and maybe the physical aspects of a person who you've known in your life? Is he a composite of people you've known, or do you feel like he has been completely a product of your imagination?
Well, he's more a product of my imagination, who is imbued with characteristics that suit the story that I want to tell. I told you that it's always been eating at me, this notion of what a tragedy it is that the people who seem to care the most and are the most sensitive are the ones who suffer the most. And so I wanted Matthew Barrett to embody that sort of person.
Yeah. The reason I ask is in my own writing, there are times when I can just identify a person who I've known in my life and decide they're the right character for this. And it really accelerates the writing in my case. Let me ask you about a famous quote that says, "I hate writing but love having written." Is that true or false for you?
It's false. I don't hate writing. There are times when it's drudgery, and there are times when it's magic. There are times when you get it right and you nail it the way you think you should nail it. That's a feeling like no other. So when I'm going through the process, I enjoy it more than I dislike it.
Now, I know that you said that you did some classes, or you had some writing coaching and so on and so forth before you launched into this. Along the way, I think anytime a person is writing, there's always that concern. Am I boring the reader with this? Am I getting into too much detail? Is this dialogue going on too long? Am I doing too much hand-holding with them? How do you assess that sort of thing, and how reliant are you on your editor to really kind of suss that out for you? Or do you feel like you pay a lot of conscious attention to that as you're reading? Because we can get into a vein that starts off very well, and we kind of ride that. We ride it for a while, and we don't necessarily. It doesn't always necessarily maintain a reader's interest along the way. There's just a lot of assessment that needs to take place there. So, kind of a long-winded way of asking you, how much attention do you pay, or what is your kind of metric for deciding that, a reader is not going to want this much information or want me to go on this long, or this particular conversation that's taking place needs to come to an end here?
I must say I haven't ever really thought of it in exactly that way. I don't pay attention to the reader as much as you in your question. And I don't mean that in any cocky sort of a way, but my writing style is more trying to say what I want to say. And you're right, sometimes you'd say, well, there's too much dialogue here, or there's too much exposition. And I come to that in sort of an organic kind of a way where it doesn't feel right to me. Now, I suppose I'm probably have the reader's interests and desires in mind. And when the book is done, or at least when one version of it's done, when I go back and read it, I will occasionally come to a part and say, no reader's going to like that, or no reader's going to understand this. But while I'm going through the process, it's more my trying to get it the way that I thought it should be.
So describe a good day of writing for you. I realize that, as you were saying earlier, you grab the time when you can. Your schedule is sporadic. So is there a day, maybe even in memory, a day when that was a day where you were extraordinarily productive, or that you remember? And maybe even you would talk a little bit about the muse. I don't know how often you felt like you've been visited by the muse during the writing process, but what does a good day of writing look like for Michael J. Collins?
Well, I'm a morning person, so I'm up early, and that's a good time for me to write. The house is quiet and everything is peaceful, and I can focus, and most people aren't up at 4:30 in the morning, so I don't have to worry about getting phone calls. And so that's probably my most productive time, is those first few hours in the morning. And you mentioned about recommending to your students that they get in a routine, and that's what I like to do. I like to have that routine. Get up at 4:30, do some exercises, and then start to write.
When you were writing your current novel, what kind of tone were you looking to strike? Can you kind of characterize the tone that you were seeking there? What kind of tone did you end up striking? Because it is a finished product. So how would you characterize the tone of it?
That's an interesting question, because I really struggled with that a lot. It's, I don't want to get into telling the whole story of the book, but it is about a struggle. So there's a dark part of it. And yet it was my intention all along that readers won't come away from the book feeling that they've just experienced something dark. The end of the book is hopeful and optimistic and uplifting, I hope. So I had to juxtapose those two things. It can't be out of the blue where all of a sudden everything seems dark and it makes no sense to make a, quote, happy ending. But the tone was a very difficult part of the book for me to write. And as you might remember, there's a couple different narrators in the book. So when Tillinghast, the attorney, tells his part of the story, he's much more erudite and cold and pragmatic. And he speaks differently and writes differently than the omniscient narrator does in the rest of the book.
Talk about the title, All Bleeding Stops. Why that title? What is it? What does it suggest? And was it your title, or did your publishing company say we focus group this one and that's the title?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Obviously, how these things work. The title for my first two books was determined by the publisher. Now, I had some input, but they determined it. This one was strictly me. If any of your listeners are surgeons, they will have heard that expression before. It's an example of the dark humor that sometimes happens in operating rooms. So as a surgeon, if you're operating on somebody and the person is bleeding a lot, you're having trouble controlling the bleeding, some wise guy might remark, all bleeding stops, meaning either you are going to control this bleeding and fix this problem, or the patient's going to expire, in which case the bleeding will stop. So most surgeons are familiar with the term, even though, as I said, it's a sort of an example of the dark humor that sometimes people engage with in these sort of serious situations. I thought it was an especially good title for this book because, in a very real sense, Matthew Barrett, the protagonist, is bleeding throughout the whole book.
In the bleeding you're talking about is more of an emotional, psychological bleeding?
Exactly, yeah. He's not physically bleeding, but he is suffering and is damaged.
Interesting. So was the title? I didn't know that about that phrase that it's used in among surgeons and what exactly it meant. But was that your choice?
Yes, it was.
It was. Okay. Interesting. So, tell us about the book. What are some of the highlights that you would convey to readers in terms of what the book is about? We've touched on that some, but maybe delve into some of the highlights and some of the kind of an overview so people have a better understanding of what they'd be delving into.
It's easy to categorize the book as a Vietnam book, but I wouldn't. Vietnam is where most of the book takes place, but if you ask me, I would tell you that this is a story about a doctor. It's not a story about a war. The doctor, young Matthew Barrett, is drafted right out of residency, sent to Vietnam as a combat surgeon, and feels that his best is not good enough. So much of the book deals with that central core question of what does a doctor do when he thinks his best isn't good enough, and how does a doctor learn to care and to give of himself without letting that destroy him. As patients, we all want to go to a doctor who is empathetic and caring and understands us and pours his soul out and fights the battle with us. But it's also difficult for the doctor to go home at the end of the day and put that stuff in a separate drawer and close it and ignore it until the next day. Matthew Barrett was not able to do that. He was constantly shamed by his inexperience and tormented by his failures, and he moves on from it. The book, I would say probably 2/3 of it is in Vietnam, but there's another section where when he goes back to the States, he becomes a harvesting doctor for a organ transplant company, and that doesn't work for him. And then the final portion of the book, he goes to Biafra, and if you remember back in the 70s, Biafra was a area in Nigeria that wanted its own independence, and there was terrible suffering there and starvation, and Matthew went and spent time working in Biafra trying to ease the situation there.
Now, this did you say this is your third book?
Yes.
So how does this rank next to your others? Do you feel like you're getting better as a novelist as you go along, that this is better than the other two? Or do you feel like maybe one of your previous works exceeded this one?
Well, I really like this book. The first two books were memoirs, and they required an entirely different approach on my part. The writing is very much different in the first two books. It's much more conversational, kind of almost as if I was speaking to the reader. I liked all the books that I've written. I've enjoyed writing them. I enjoyed describing the events that happened to me. All Bleeding Stops was, when I first looked into it, I thought, well, my first two books were memoirs, and I'm constrained by the facts and the truth. I can't just make things up, but these are stories about things that actually happened. With All Bleeding Stops, I thought, this is fiction, and I can say anything I want, so it's going to be much easier. And that did not turn out to be the case, because unlimited possibilities leave you with a whole lot more decisions to make. So I struggled with how to do it and how to put it together and how to make things make sense. And as you know, you can't, if your goal is to preach a sermon in your book, it's not going to succeed. You need to tell a story and let the reader hear the story and make his or her own conclusions about what it means and what it was meant to mean. So I found it much more difficult to write fiction, but in many ways it was even more enjoyable. It was hard work, but in the end I liked the product and I was happy with how it went.
It's interesting you say that, because there are so many nonfiction, great, celebrated nonfiction writers who look to move over to fiction writing, only to find out it just isn't for them. Christopher Hitchens was an example of that. A tremendous nonfiction writer, tried, a good friend of Martin Amis, the great novelist, decided he wanted to write some novels and gave it up very quickly because it was that intimidating. Tom Wolfe of Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test and so on plunged into by his own account, was crestfallen because despite his greatness, when he started writing fiction, he was basically spinning his wheels. Obviously, he got over that. It took time, and I think that's really what writing's about. Is there's a tremendous amount of perseverance. It's truly an act of faith and so on. So it's just one of those lessons we learn along the way, and we pick up from the experiences of others as well. You use the word struggle, and that brought to mind writer's block. Have you ever had any bouts of writer's block, or have you always been able to get some kind of gainful language on the page?
I always tell myself that I've never had writer's block, and it's mostly true. Now, I've had times where I've sat down and just can't figure out what to do next. I say, how am I going to get this character from here to there? But it's not so much that I feel blocked or that I'm unable to know what to do or to get something down on paper. It's that the answers I've come up with don't satisfy me.
Our guest has been Dr. Michael J. Collins. His new novel is called All Bleeding Stops. It's available now. You know where to find it, all the major book platforms. The novel takes place in Vietnam, but it's more than a Vietnam novel, as we heard Michael say. So, Michael, thank you for taking the time, and I wish you the best of luck with the new novel and as well as the one you're working on. Thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate it. All the best to you, too.